Human capital is a key pillar of entrepreneurial success, but other resources also play a role. A second major driver of entrepreneurial success is financial capital. We can even say that access to finance is an essential condition for entrepreneurial activity, as virtually every startup needs some financial resources. Of course, there are steps that can be taken without external funding, like having a great idea or creating a positive and inspiring working environment. And the entrepreneur should try to exhaust them. However, many steps, even in the very early stage, do require financial capital. Thus, let's first list possible sources of funding for a startup. First, entrepreneurs' own capital. Money that entrepreneurs own and are willing to invest in their startups. Second, family and friends who are able and willing to provide money to the entrepreneurs. These are informal sources of financial capital. There are two other formal sources as well. First, debt financing. Similarly to a car loan or an apartment mortgage, startup can get funding by means of a loan from financial institutions like banks. And second, equity financing, which comes from professional or institutional investors who are specialized in investing in startups. These four represent basically the whole financing universe for startups. Let's analyze them individually. The informal ones, entrepreneurs' own capital and capital provided by family and friends, are common initial sources of financing. They can be relatively easy to get compared to the formal ones, and entrepreneurs also get more flexible deals as they have different repayment schemes on their disposal, not just the formal ones. However, there is a limit to the informal capital. Its availability, particularly in high volumes. Larger investments are usually out of reach of both entrepreneurs and individuals close to them. That is why the formal sources are crucial. The formal investors are able to provide by far larger amounts of capital. There are differences among formal sources of capital too. Firstly, there are banks and other lending institutions which provide debt capital. In return to the received capital, startups are supposed to pay back the loan in predefined installments as well as an interest rate on top of that. It should be remarked that lending institutions do not own the startup. That is, they have no control of how the startup is run. Once the loan is paid back, the relationship with the lender ends. That is especially important as the business becomes more valuable. On the other hand, there are some issues with debt financing which stem from the very nature of startups. Namely, startups, and particularly the most innovative ones, have the following features. They lack hard, tangible assets that could be used as collateral, that is guaranteed to the lenders. When they do possess assets, they are typically intangible. For instance, human capital of entrepreneurs cannot even be measured. These cannot be used as collateral as well. Finally, by definition, they have a short track record as they are newly created companies. All of these make access to debt extremely difficult. The lack of tangible assets, collateral, and track record make it challenging for lending institutions to assess the value and potential of startups. Therefore, in reality, startups rarely manage to get a loan. Exactly that is the reason for emergence of the other formal source of capital, the institutional investors who provide equity financing and focus on startups only. They are specialized firms called venture capital firms, comprising experts who are better able to assess the value of startups despite the lack of tangible assets, and hence are more prone to invest in them. Equity investors get shares of ownership into the startup, a fact that may have both pros and cons. A first advantage is that no payback of money is needed. Instead, a portion of the startup's equity is shared with the venture capital firm. As the venture capital firm owns a part of the startup, their investors will usually try to help the startup succeed. So venture capital investors do not only provide financial capital, they also share their human and social capital. On a more critical note, as the venture capital firm has ownership rights over the startup, it shares the returns and risk of the venture with the entrepreneur. As a consequence, it will generally try to strongly influence the decisions, which results in a partial loss of control of the startup for entrepreneurs. Overall, all four types of financing might be necessary during the startup development. Hence, being aware of how they work and understanding the right funding model is vital. As we have seen, there are no doubts that financial capital on the one side and human capital on the other are essential for the startup and its core operations. Nevertheless, core operations alone are not sufficient to deliver the whole potential value of the startup. The so-called complementary assets are as necessary. In particular, the complementary assets are the ones that are not strictly related to the startup's key knowledge, yet they're still instrumental for delivering the value the startup is creating. In order to commercialize an invention, the innovative entrepreneur typically requires that the know-how in question is utilized in conjunction with other capabilities or assets. Services such as marketing, competitive manufacturing, distribution channels, and after-sales support are almost always needed. A good example of the importance of complementary assets is the story of Robert William Kearns, an American inventor who developed windshield wiper system used on most cars from 1969 till today. He obviously needed cars to deliver the value of his invention, but as he was not able to make the cars himself, he had to find a way with the companies that did, which was a challenging process. According to his story, an interesting movie called Flash of Genius was recently made. So, the same startup does not need to be in control of all assets, and typically it is not. In return, that means that startups should be partnering with other startups or even established companies who are specialized in providing the complementary assets. In that process, it is essential for entrepreneurs to understand what is the competitive advantage of their own startup and how they can maintain it even when they collaborate with the other firms. In case that is not possible, a startup should also try to own the necessary complementary assets and by that protect its competitive advantage against the other firms. As a minimum, entrepreneurs should be aware of the existence of complementary assets, who controls them, and how they can reach them without jeopardizing their own activities. The final factor for entrepreneurial success is the so-called social capital of entrepreneurs. Social capital stands for the extent to which the entrepreneurs are effectively connected to their social environment, which in turn should enable them to more easily access the other resources. Social capital can help them find the right co-founders, that is, the right human capital. It can also be essential for reaching external finance. Personally knowing investors improves the trust and facilitates easier access to funding. Finally, strong social capital is valuable for finding strategic partners that can provide the necessary complementary assets without hurting startups' core operations. To summarize, the four fundamental factors for entrepreneurial success are human capital, financial capital, complementary assets, and finally, social capital.